They thought they could underpay us, skim our tips, and get away with it. I played the long game, and by the time they realized it, it was already too late. Back when I was still in college, I picked up a job at a local delivery place. Not some national chain, just a neighborhood joint that promised flexible hours and, surprisingly, a decent system. They provided the delivery vehicles. That seemed like a massive win at the time. Most delivery drivers I knew were putting miles on their own cars, chewing through brakes, tires, and fuel without reimbursement. This setup looked better. Less wear and tear on my already beat-up sedan. It felt like I'd found a rare corner of decent employment. That illusion didn't last long. During my first week, I learned how the company justified this perk. They took a percentage of every driver's tips, claiming it was to cover vehicle costs. But they didn't phrase it like that in the hiring paperwork. It was all positioned as standard policy and legal. We'd be told that tips were pooled into the delivery vehicle maintenance fund. Sounds good in theory, right? In practice, it meant I was walking out some nights with less than minimum wage, even with tips. I wasn't alone either. Almost every driver grumbled about it. The difference was, most of them just accepted it. They needed the money, and the hassle of fighting back didn't seem worth it. That was the calculation. Management knew it. Worse, if your paycheck dropped below the legal hourly minimum, which happened constantly, they'd make you drive in and sign a form. The form was shady as hell. You had to sign something like, "I confirm I made minimum wage due to cash tips not recorded on the clock." In other words, "We're shorting you, but we'll all pretend you weren't." At first, I didn't say much. I was the new guy. The hours were decent. The manager liked me. I got good routes. But the more I worked, the more I realized just how much they were taking. $20 to $40 a night on average, sometimes more. Over the course of a week, it added up. Month after month, it was hundreds. Multiply that by every driver, and this little operation was skimming thousands in stolen wages, all under the radar. The worst part? They were counting on people not knowing their rights, or being too afraid to speak up. Unfortunately for them, I did know my rights. And I wasn't afraid to dig deeper. What they didn't realize was that labor law, especially around wages and tips, isn't just something companies can interpret however they want. In our state, tips belong to the employee. Period. Unless there's a clearly defined tip pool, which this wasn't, they can't take a dime. It wasn't just unethical. It was illegal. So I made a choice. Instead of quitting like everyone else, I stayed. I clocked in, took my routes, and every single night, I tracked every dollar they took from me. Once I realized how much money was being skimmed, I knew that just quitting wouldn't do anything. I had heard about people walking away from jobs like this before. Angry, frustrated, maybe with a rant on social media, but it never went anywhere. The business kept running, the managers stayed employed, and nothing changed. I wanted this to be different. So I kept my mouth shut and started documenting everything. I created a spreadsheet on my personal laptop. Every shift, I wrote down how many deliveries I made, the cash and card tips I received, and how much the company claimed to deduct. I got creative too. I kept copies of any minimum wage forms I was made to sign and backed them up to a cloud folder just in case. I even recorded some shift meetings on my phone when the manager explained the tip deduction process to new hires. I wasn't just building a complaint. I was building a case. I started researching labor law more seriously. Not just blog posts or social media threads, but actual state labor regulations. In our state, employers are legally required to pay employees at least minimum wage, regardless of tips, and they cannot deduct tips for vehicle expenses unless there's a documented, agreed-upon policy. Ours wasn't. It was all word of mouth and threats. That meant they were vulnerable. I started printing out relevant laws and comparing them to our pay stubs. Every time a discrepancy showed up, I highlighted it, scanned it, and stored it with the rest of my growing archive. I learned that the Department of Labor accepts anonymous tips. I learned that you don't have to be fired to file a complaint. And I also learned that wage theft claims can be retroactive, meaning if I could prove this had been going on for months, they could be forced to repay not just me but everyone. But I was careful. If the company got even a hint that I was building a case, they'd probably cut me loose fast. So I leaned into the role of the model employee. I showed up early, took the tough shifts, covered for co-workers. I smiled during meetings, nodded when management told us things we knew were wrong, and kept detailed records every night. Other drivers started venting more around me. I didn't say much, just listened. Every complaint was another piece of confirmation that I wasn't imagining it. This was systemic. At one point, a coworker asked why I hadn't quit yet. I told him I needed the hours. He nodded and didn't ask again. But I could tell he didn't buy it. I didn't care. Because I was getting close to having everything I needed. The only missing piece was a clean, indisputable trigger, something that would show retaliation, bad faith, or a clear violation I could hang the whole case on. I didn't have to wait long. One night, I came in for my regular shift. I clocked in, grabbed my tablet, and got ready to start deliveries. 10 minutes later, the manager pulled me aside. He didn't even make eye contact when he said it. "Your services are no longer needed." That was it. No explanation. No paperwork. Just a cold dismissal. He probably thought that was the end of it. But I had already prepared for this moment. What he didn't realize was that firing me without cause, especially after months of documenting illegal activity, gave me exactly what I needed. They weren't just stealing wages anymore. Now, it was retaliation. And that made the case even stronger. The night I got fired, I didn't argue. I didn't ask why or demand to speak to someone higher up. I simply turned in the delivery tablet, walked out to my car, and drove home in silence. But I wasn't angry. I was ready. The months of quiet prep had paid off. I already had the folders organized. Scanned pay stubs, screenshots of tip deductions, recordings of shift meetings, and even copies of those sketchy, I made minimum wage forms. I had collected statements from other drivers who were willing to speak up too. A few had left the job recently and, after hearing what I was building, agreed to write short emails describing what they'd experienced. It wasn't hard. Everyone had a story. The next morning, I started with the state's Department of Labor website. Their wage complaint form was surprisingly simple. I filled it out carefully, attached digital evidence, and flagged the employer's name and contact information. I explained how tips were deducted illegally, how wages often fell below the legal minimum, and how we were pressured to sign forms to cover it up. I also explained I had been fired immediately after pushing back and that I suspected retaliation. I submitted it and got a confirmation email almost instantly. That was step 1. Next, I went to the IRS's tip reporting fraud form. That one took a bit more time. I wasn't accusing the company of tax fraud lightly, but based on what I saw, they were underreporting tips to avoid payroll taxes, especially with the way they were skimming from credit card transactions. I explained what I saw, how it was recorded in pay stubs, and how they justified it internally. I gave dates, amounts, and the names of managers who explained the process. I sent that off too. Then, just to round it out, I contacted the local health department. That part wasn't even related to my wages, but I had spent enough time in the back area to know things weren't clean. Employees were handling food without gloves, cleaning chemicals were stored near prep surfaces, and some of the delivery cars were in disgusting shape. That last part might seem petty, but I'd driven a vehicle that reeked of moldy takeout more than once. I sent photos from my phone and described what I'd seen. It was a trifecta: wage theft complaint, tax fraud tip, health code report. And the best part? All of it was real. I wasn't exaggerating or making anything up. I didn't have to. The company had done the work for me. They just assumed no one would ever fight back. Once everything was submitted, I waited. I didn't need to check in. I knew from my research that it could take a few weeks or even months before I'd hear anything. These kinds of investigations take time. But I had planted the seeds, and I knew exactly where they were growing. Meanwhile, I got a new job, cleaner, better pay, no tip theft. I didn't talk about what had happened. I kept my head down and stayed quiet. But inside, I was counting the days. I knew that when it started hitting the fan, it would hit hard. and I wouldn't have to lift another finger. A few weeks went by without any news. I had almost settled into my new routine. Different job, better environment, no sketchy tip deductions, and actual respect from management. But I hadn't forgotten. I still checked the Department of Labor website occasionally, just out of curiosity, and kept an eye on local news alerts. Then one day, a friend who still worked at the old delivery company texted me, "Something's going on." Apparently, a state investigator had shown up unannounced. Clipboards, badges, everything. They'd started pulling employee records, asking for payroll logs, and interviewing staff. My friend said the manager looked like he'd seen a ghost. That was the first wave. Over the next couple of weeks, I heard more. A few former drivers reached out to thank me after being contacted by the labor board. Some were being asked to verify their hours and wages. One of them said, "I didn't think they'd ever actually get investigated. Guess you made it happen." The best part? The company had no idea who filed the complaint. The process was anonymous. I could picture the management team scrambling to figure out who betrayed them, probably going over old texts, trying to find signs. But it didn't matter. I was long gone, and they were dealing with something much bigger. Then came Wave 2. One morning I opened my inbox and saw a message from someone I didn't recognize. It was a former manager, not one of the bad ones, but someone who had left a few months before me. He said he'd heard the IRS had been in touch with the company. Apparently, someone had tipped them off about underreported tip income and suspicious payroll practices. That wasn't surprising. What was surprising was how fast the pressure escalated. Word got around that the company had been audited, and things weren't looking good. I heard they had to bring in an outside firm just to get their books in order, and several staff members were put on administrative leave while records were reviewed. One of the people put on leave? The manager who fired me. By this point, things had spiraled beyond anything I could have expected. It was no longer about my paycheck or a few lost tips. This was full-on damage control for a business that had built its operations on illegal shortcuts. Even the health department got involved. A colleague messaged me saying an inspector showed up one afternoon and shut down the prep area until repairs were made. The place failed a surprise inspection for multiple violations, including improper storage of cleaning chemicals and pest activity. They had to close for 2 days. That was the moment it felt real. They had laughed it off when people quit. Ignored complaints. Treated everyone as disposable. But now they were bleeding from 3 different directions: wage theft, tax fraud, and health violations, all because they underestimated the wrong person. And all I had done was tell the truth. By the time a few months had passed, the delivery company I once worked for wasn't the same. From the outside, it still had the same name and branding, but behind the scenes, it was barely holding itself together. The Department of Labor had completed its investigation. Several current and former drivers told me they received checks in the mail, back pay settlements that covered underpaid hours and stolen tips. Some were small. Others were hundreds of dollars. A few had even forgotten how much they'd lost until the money arrived. I never received anything myself. I had moved on before the checks were sent out, and I never expected to be included. But that didn't bother me. I hadn't filed the complaints for personal gain. I just wanted them to feel the weight of what they'd done. The tax audit hit them even harder. The company had to hire an accounting firm to rebuild months of financial records, and the IRS had reportedly issued fines for underreported income related to tips. Nobody said the exact number publicly, but one former employee estimated it was in the tens of thousands. If they had been skimming even a few bucks from every delivery for a year or more, the fines added up fast, especially when you include penalties and interest. Then there was the health department. That wasn't a one-time inspection. After the initial shutdown, they were put on a watch list for random rechecks. A few months later, I heard they failed a follow-up due to continued cleanliness issues in the delivery vehicles. Apparently, the company hadn't even bothered to fix the mold problem in one of the vans. That van was finally towed off the lot and scrapped. New hires came and went. Reviews online dropped. On social media, customers started complaining about late deliveries and poor service. The place just didn't have the staff anymore. No one wanted to work there. And still, I kept my mouth shut. To this day, I've never told a single person in that company what I did. Maybe they figured it out. Maybe they're still guessing. But I didn't need credit. I didn't need an apology. I just needed the system to do what it was supposed to do. And for once, it did. A friend of mine once asked if I'd ever go back just to see it all in person. I said no. I had nothing left to prove. My revenge didn't come with shouting, threats, or drama. It came with screenshots, laws, and patience. They thought no one would ever push back. They were wrong. In the end, all I had to do was stay calm, stay smart, and let the truth do the work.